When I was younger, I had a huge ambition to live my life on the very dangerous edge, to experience life in all of its delicious extremes. I was excited by the idea of a limitless reality. The potential was within my reach, but it always seemed to be just beyond my grasp. Standing between me and my dreams was a line of fear. Not just fear, actually, terror. Anxiety that was so raw and so immediate that I was forced to shrink and hide and feel ashamed of all my grand ambitions. I was beaten back to what I knew, the safe, the secure, those magnolia walls of comfortable living. This failure to live authentically triggered in me a massive depression. I'd find myself waking at 4 in the morning in a cold sweat, my wife lying next to me asleep, my kids in the next room also asleep, a house full of people, but I was completely alone. I felt like Reinhold Messner, the legendary climber, when he got stuck on the inhospitable mountain Nanga Parbat. He was too scared to go up. He was too scared to go down. He was too scared to stay where he was. At that moment in time on the mountain, Messner said that he was afraid to live. I nearly cried when I heard that. Afraid to live, that was me. I was afraid to live. The ego tricks you into believing that you are the only person in the whole world who feels afraid. Messner told me that it was okay to be scared. Fear is a part of the human condition. We all feel it. And yet, at the same time, at the very same time, he encouraged me to be brave, be very brave. Lean into the sharp edges. Embrace the fear. Marinate in your terror. Fear is what keeps people ordinary, if we listen to it. Messner inspired me to be extraordinary. And I was inspired. But where do you go with that? I mean, inspiration is good, but what are the modalities of overcoming fear? Like most people, when the fear hit me, I looked for solutions out there in the world. Specifically, I looked in books. Books that promised to give me the answers. Books that did not deliver. Either the authors didn't know the answers, or they were too afraid to share the answers, even from the safety of a page. I asked my doctor. This was after another long bout of depression. He gave me his solution in a bottle of pills, and my heart sank, because even he didn't know the truth, or if he did, he wasn't saying. Then something happened. I hit rock bottom, and I just thought to myself, I got really angry. I'm not having this anymore. I'm not having it. I've got a wife. I've got kids. I'm not going to give my life over to fear. I refuse. So I decided to confront my fears, all of them. I drew a pyramid on a piece of paper, a fear pyramid, and on every step of that pyramid, I wrote down each of my fears in ascending order. The least fear on the bottom step, the worst fear on the top step. Then, I set about confronting my fears one at a time until I reached the peak. My logic was this: if I could overcome all my fears, I could live the life I really wanted to live as a writer, a buccaneer, a bohemian drinking Lavazza coffee at 2 in the morning with my heroes. I could be free. I could be free. And another thing, and I distinctly remember thinking this in my darkest hour, at my lowest point, I promised myself, when I find the truth, I'm going to tell everyone. I started my pyramid with the one invisible fear that we nearly all share, the fear of admitting that I was afraid. Isn't that delicious, the denial? Isn't that strange? I was afraid to admit that I was afraid. I didn't want to appear weak. And if I admitted that I was afraid, that would mean I'd have to do something about it. And that really scared me. It was easier to deny fear than it was to face it. Doing a ruthless inventory of my fears was the first fear overcome right there. That was the first step, the pivotal step. When the first fear dissolved, it left a vacuum. It left a vacuum in me. Courage filled that vacuum. Each time I exposed myself to a fear, the same things happened. I became desensitized to the fear. The nature of the fear was liberated, and the energy, the effulgence that was locked inside the fear, was transformed into personal power. Each victory gave me the courage and the skill and the experience to face the next fear, and the next fear, and the next. As I climbed, as I overcame the obvious fears, other more subtle fears started to appear. They writ themselves large across the steps. It was as though the mundane fears were like layers that covered the things I was really afraid of. As I peeled those layers back, I realized I was afraid of my own potential. As strange as it might sound, I was afraid of success. Success meant change. If I was successful, how would that affect my wife? How would it affect my kids? How would it affect my friends if I suddenly went from being Geoff the factory worker to Geoff the published author, appearing live on morning TV with Richard and Judy? The fear of success went on my list. I was afraid of my wife. This came as a great shock to me. She was a good girl, but I let her bully me. Anything for a quiet life. That's what I kidded myself, but in truth I was afraid of her. So my wife went on the list. I was also afraid of my mum. I love my mum. I love her bones. So this is very difficult to say in public, but back then I was afraid of her. Actually, I was not so much afraid of my mum as I was afraid of my mum withdrawing her love. That terrified me. I was afraid of abandonment. This fear probably came from the fact that I was sexually abused at the age of 11 by a teacher that I idolized. This monster destroyed my trust in the world at a very vulnerable age. The fear of abandonment went on my pyramid. Climbing that pyramid was my first great rebellion against fear. As I climbed, as I overcame each fear, my courage expanded exponentially until eventually I was able to reach the top step and face my ultimate fear, violent confrontation. I overcame this fear in the only logical way you can. I took a job as a nightclub bouncer in a city polled as the most violent in Europe for its size and population. There's an old saying in Zen, if you want to master fear, you should do all your practice in hell. Believe me, working as a bouncer in Coventry was like traversing. It was like traversing all 9 circles of Dante's Inferno. Over the next decade, I was in hundreds of fights. I witnessed thousands of violent confrontations. 4 of my friends were murdered. I went from being afraid of spiders in the bath to standing my ground in life and death situations. But if I believed that violent confrontation was my ultimate fear, I was in for a nasty shock. I was about to meet my nemesis. I was sat in a cafe alone one Sunday morning. I thought I was alone. I looked across to the table opposite, and there he was, as real as you. The teacher that abused me when I was a boy. He filled the room. The moment I saw him, my body started to shake. I could feel the adrenaline from my toes to my scalp. And everything inside me said, run, run, run. Man, I've never been so afraid. I was 11 again. I was 11, I was 11, I was 11. I was a boy, I was just a boy. I knew what I had to do. I knew, but even with all my experience, even with all my preparation, even with all my knowledge, I did not want to know. I did not want to know because what I had to do was asking too much of me, too much. I'd been given the opportunity to enact the ultimate revenge, but I just couldn't prise myself out of that chair and walk the million miles that stood between me and him. I could have walked out. No one would know. Who would know? Me. I would know. I was back on the mountain again. Nanga Parbat. Too scared to go up. Too scared to go down. Too scared to stay where I was. At that moment in time in the cafe, I was afraid to live. Mesner whispered in my ear, be brave, be brave, be very brave. Lean in, embrace, marinate. I got up, I walked across, I stood in front of him. He looked up at me. He did not recognize me. Why would he? I was not a boy anymore. I looked like a photo fit from a police wanted poster. I said to him, I had to really fight to control my emotions. I was nearly crying. You don't remember me, but when I was a boy, you sexually abused me. He immediately went to stand up, anger and denial all over his face. I put my hand out, sit down. He hesitated. I said it again, sit down. It was a command. It was not a request. He sat back down. He looked terrified. You abused me when I was a boy. You ruined me when I was a boy. But you need to know that I forgive you. I forgive you. I said it twice. Not for him, I said it twice for me. My words broke him. He was the final fear of my pyramid, the last step. As I went to walk away, he stood up and put his hand out like that. He wanted me to shake his hand. It hung in the air, his fingers were trembling. I knew what he was saying. I knew exactly what he was saying. Are you forgiving me? Or are you forgiving me? Now, I knew I could crush this man physically. I could destroy him. I could do that quite easily. He was no match for me. I'd honed my skills over a lifetime in preparation for this one moment. But I understood the language of violence, and it would not be enough. A violent revenge would not be enough for me. I needed more. I needed to exorcise this demon from my mind. And the only way I was going to do that was to forgive him, give him over, let him go, properly forgive him. I knew that if I didn't forgive him, I would never get rid of my fear. I knew that. I absolutely knew it. If I didn't forgive him, fear would always hold me to ransom. He would always hold me to ransom. I was not prepared to let that happen. I refused to let that happen. So I shook his hand, and I gave him back to his fate, and I walked away. For the first time in my adult life, I could breathe. I was free. This man, my abuser, he hung himself some years later in a hotel room. People asked me, what did you feel when you heard? Oh man, compassion, such compassion, such compassion. Against my own will, I just felt such compassion. I wrote a film about it. I am a writer after all. The film is called Romans 12:20. It's inspired by a verse in St. Paul's letters to the Romans. Vengeance belongs to me, and I shall repay, says the Lord. So if thine enemy hunger, feed him. If he thirsts, give him drink. For in so doing, thou shalt heap coals of fire on his head. I always promised myself that one day I'd find the truth, but what is the truth? The truth is that fear is not real. It's an illusion, a false belief. The only breath it has is the breath we give it. I am certain of this because I've got the proof. I live the most amazing life. I'm married to the girl of my dreams. I work from home as a writer. I go to work in my slippers. My life is the proof. I guess that's why I'm here today, just to tell you what you're aiming for, whatever that might be, is possible. Of course, everything is possible. Everything is possible. If you don't believe me, just look around you at the vast expanse of this incredible universe. The proof is right in front of you. Beliefs can be changed. Scars can be healed. Delusions can be dispelled. But only if you walk towards your fear. Only if you embrace your fear. As you get closer, your three-dimensional monsters will turn into two-dimensional cartoons. As you get closer still, those monsters will vanish into thin air. The poet Rumi summed it up beautifully. Fear knocked on the door. Love answered. There was no one there. At my lowest point, I promised that when I found the truth, I would tell others. I would tell them in books. I would tell them in articles. I would tell them in plays. And I would tell them in films. One day, I might even get the chance, the privilege, the great honor to stand in front of a TED audience. Then I could tell the whole world. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.